Good afternoon, everyone. This is Therese Brown with the Association of Catholic Publishers, coming to you today with our webinar with Jason Spanos from K&K Software on direct-to-consumer channels. I'm going to let Jason introduce himself in just a few minutes. We're going to wait for the last couple of people to arrive, and then we're going to begin. A couple of housekeeping things for you. We've scheduled an hour. We will not go beyond that. We respect your time and want to make it as useful and fulfilling as possible for you. There are a couple of ways that you can raise questions or add comments. One is through the chat feature. You can chat to individuals. You can chat directly with me or with the whole group at any time. Also, you can ask questions. Just so you know, I will be monitoring the questions and the chat throughout this webinar. So if there is anything that you want to raise or share, please feel free to do so. Towards the end, Jason is going to leave some time for us to ask questions, and that we will get to as much as we can. Before we begin, if there is anything that you need, anything that you want, just let me know, as I said, through the chat or the questions. And I think we are going to get started. So let me just very briefly introduce you to Jason. I'm going to let Jason tell you more about him and what he does, and then we'll go ahead. This is Jason Spanos with K&K Software. Jason, it's been a pleasure meeting you and talking with you in preparation for this webinar. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about the insights that you and your team have had on this particular topic. So handing it over to Jason. Go ahead, Jason, it's all yours.
Thank you. All right, let's make sure the technology is working here. I think it is. So very quickly, for those of you who haven't met me, my background, I have been in the large software space for my entire career, which spans back to about 1996. And I have worked with two main things of technology the whole time: data and also interfacing with systems, right? And when I started, data was all about taking data from different departments and trying to combine it into larger systems that could then share the data and do calculations and functionality on the data, right? So over time, what happened is those types of systems that did that, whether they're accounting systems or inventory or ERP, they grew bigger and bigger and bigger, but they started to hit some hard edges, okay? And one of those hard edges related to what data was inside the company, generated by the company, versus what data was outside of the company, which started with, well, quite frankly, the internet, right? That was the big catalyst back in the 90s. And how these two areas of data had this hard wall between them. So at a certain point, systems like CRM started, which was more about companies looking outside of their own bubble of data that was internal to the company, but it still didn't really capture the data that was coming in from outside of the company. Okay, and in the meantime, you had things like EDI and other mechanisms as well that were more interface mechanisms for data to get data in and out. Okay, now as social media, things like Facebook, things like LinkedIn, Twitter became more and more prevalent, you started to have this more chaotic group of data. Actually, it was several groups of data that were coming into play. And the question was, okay, this exists on its own platform, like Facebook or LinkedIn, or even things like Amazon. What do we need to do in order to capture that data and make it work for us? Okay, and that's really the segue into the topic that we have today. It's B2C channel building, right? So how does this B2C journey work? A lot of publishers were forced to examine the B2C game because of the pandemic, but quite honestly, a lot of publishers were also just saying, what can we do today using the tools we have, right? If they already had tools, they kept using them. If they didn't, they maybe explored, using them, but it was just a very quick response. So now what we're finding is that more and more companies are looking at it more systematically now that things are easing a little bit, now that they've realized that they're still here, and they're saying that the landscape has changed. So the new landscape is going to be more and more virtual. Uh, Distribution channels have been questioned and challenged in the past, and now we're looking at what new distribution channels are happening in the future. So at this point, I'm going to turn on the slide deck, and I'm going to bring you through some slides in terms of how you can think about the D2C journey and what aspects you need to look at or look about as an organization in order to strategically approach it for the future. Okay. So let me share my screen. All right, I believe that everybody at this point should now see a picture of a painted lady in the background, and it says B2C channel building. So what I'd like to do here is explore what it looks like in terms of risk in the supply chain and use the analogy of a stock portfolio. A way that a lot of people used to approach their supply chain for different products is they would have a supplier that would then send materials, we'll just call them materials right now, to a manufacturer that would then create the product, whether that was in-house or whether that was, another entity doing that for you. That would go to a distributor, and that would end up going to a customer. And there were several silos like this, or several streams like this, where you would have this for different products, sometimes a few of the same product from one supplier or distributor, and you would have different customers. The problem is each time that there's a milestone between these different segments, there's a risk point. There's a risk of failure. And with the pandemic, many of these risk points were challenged and sometimes or oftentimes compromised. Okay. So if you were looking at this like a stock portfolio, it's fairly common knowledge that what you want to do is you want to diversify your portfolio. Now, of course, you have to do this with caution or with some wisdom, because the more that you diversify your portfolio, the more management it takes to keep it maintained. But now what we're doing here is we can actually have multiple suppliers, which could in theory send material to multiple manufacturers, which then you've got multiple distributors, right? Which in theory could also be in competition. And all these multiple channels could get to the same type of customer. Okay, so examples of this would be, you've got two different paper suppliers, right? Examples of this, you've got various print shops. Examples of this, the distribution channels, you could have, brick and mortar, Barnes and Noble. You could have Amazon. You could have, Christian bookstores. You could have churches, dioceses, direct channels that way. And that's more what we're talking about today. And all of these could potentially reach your customer. Okay, so again, the more that you can diversify here, the lower the risk is to your supply chain. Okay. Now let's take a look at what the typical customer journey is. This is the way that people have classically thought of a customer journey. First of all, people find out about your product, but only casually. Then they start exploring it, figuring out what it's about. They eventually buy it. They start using it. Maybe they have some questions or some challenges or something like this, and so they ask questions. Then they start to really engage and spread the word about your product. Let's assume that this is a blockbuster hit, and ideally they stay loyal and everybody lives happily ever after. However, that's not the case these days. The world has changed. This is much more how the customer journey looks these days, right? You'll notice that there's not really a starting point. Any of these things could be the starting point in a true customer journey, right? It could be a recommendation from someone else. It could be awareness that you saw it somewhere, through ads or Facebook or something like this. Uh, it could be, you know, you already know people that are using it. It could be, various points here. Twitter, all these different things, review sites, there's all sorts of different ways. But you'll also notice that, the paths could go really anywhere and the paths could go back and forward. So really, this is the new customer journey. And if I do try and bring some sort of order to it, which we somewhat can still, you'll notice that it goes from lead gen to campaigns. This is all on the marketing side, to a website. There's content, there's recommendations, next best actions, support, cross-sell, upsell. This is now your customer experience, but you'll notice that the arrows go in both directions. It's not simply something you can think of as a linear flow, but you can actually go back and forth, right? The lead gen could go to a campaign, but maybe that doesn't do the trick. So maybe it goes back to lead gen and maybe things get revisited in 6 months. Okay, so this now, the three areas are still there: marketing, sales, and service or support, but it's a much more dynamic journey and definitely not a one-way linear journey. Okay, so then the question is, how do you actually put the steps in place to turn these prospects into customers, right? How do you actually accomplish D2C? And we found that there are 4 main steps to this. Okay, I'm going to quickly show them here and then we're going to dig into each one. Number one, of course, you want to nurture more demand, right? Chronologically, this is where you start. How do you do that? You typically have to personalize the buyer experience, and this makes the prospect invested. Okay. The third element, you want to build relationships at scale. What we found because of the pandemic is you need some sort of systems in place that you are not, as you scale your customers, you are not having to scale your effort in a linear fashion. And then finally, you've done all this work, collected all this data. How do you use that to drive insights and decisions in the future? Okay, so let's take the first one, nurture more demand, right? The 3 areas of this: number one, generate leads across multiple channels. So in other words, you have to initiate leads, right? This is a very classic funnel in some ways, if you want to look at it that way. This is nothing that you don't already know. So this is the initiation stage, right? Across multiple channels. So you want to have your feelers out there. You want to have your outreach out there in multiple places. Once that is accomplished, you want to nurture and prioritize the leads. So you need to get some sense of who these people are, right, in order to do this. And then you want it to enter the true funnel, I guess you could say. Really what we're talking about here is the funnel above the funnel, right? So that it goes into the true funnel and you already have a lot of information collected about it. Okay. The second element, personalizing the buyer experience. In order to personalize the experience, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand who the buyer is, right? You have to get a sense of them. You have to get a sense of what they're about, okay? What do you do with this information? You use the information in order to predict how they will think about things, in order to predict what they are going to do next, not just how they're going to think, that's the thought side, but the action side, right? And if you can use this information in order to predict who is going to do what and how, then you can build out a connected, personalized journey, all right, for them. Okay, so again, I know I'm going very slow over this, but this is truly the part, this is where the art comes in, right? You have to understand who the audience is, predict what they're going to do and when, and then craft your path for them so that there's a very natural flow that they can journey along. And remember, that flow is going to twist and weave in different ways. Okay, building relationships at scale, right? So what we just talked about is easy to do even with very manual processes, as long as you're only trying to reach a few prospects. Okay, and I say it tongue in cheek, but there's some truth to it, right? The steps are still the same. Again, you have to find out where your audience is. So there's lots of people out there. There's this huge mass of people. you have to find the stakeholders and the decision makers, right? How are you going to do that? You're going to need systems to do that. You're going to have to cast your web very far in order to catch little snippets of data. This is where you may put something out on your own website, for example, that if you want to access some data, maybe you just have to put in your first name. Later on, if they return and they want to access some other data, maybe you just ask them what city they live in. And slowly but surely, you start to get a sense of who these people are, right? Who they are, where they are, what's important to them, right? Once you've done this, you can start to put them along that customer journey that was on the previous slide. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to gain the credibility of the audience, right? It used to be thought that if you could just get somebody on your sales track, for your website or whatever, that would be enough and they would buy and that would be the end of it. They would be a customer. But now it's much more short little investigations that people are doing, and they are slowly gaining credibility, or you are gaining credibility, I should say, with them over time, right? Trust takes time. You can, just like I said earlier, you can think of it as a stock portfolio for diversification, for risk diversification mitigation. You also have to think of this as a relationship, because it is a relationship and relationships take time. Uh, it doesn't happen overnight. The only way it can happen overnight is if you've got that credibility due to other external sources that are already recommending you, right? And then once you do have that relationship established, you need to be able to keep the relationship on track. And in order to do that, just like in any other relationship, you need to communicate, okay? If people have a sense that you're communicating with them, relationships can prosper. If people have a sense that you're not really interested in sharing with them and listening to what they have to say, relationships go off track. So you want to design your customer journey that it's a sharing of information both ways. Sometimes you're giving information, sometimes you're asking them what they think. Okay. The next part, make insight-driven decisions. Okay. Now, the first one here is pretty obvious. You want to improve performance, right, of the people that are doing, that are in the trenches on your team doing this. How do you do that? One of the most powerful ways that you can do that is communicate to your own people, first of all, what is important. Okay, there's lots of instances where companies that are lacking the internal communication have lots of people that are eager to go out there and attract people to the company, pursue revenue goals, but they're not aware of how their decisions are impacting the whole of the company. Okay, so you want to make sure that you have tools in place that are giving your people visibility and understanding of what the goals are, so that when it is time to make the decisions, they are empowered to do so, not simply because you've given them authority to do so, but you've given them, through communication, you've given them the visibility to do so and the understanding of what their actions will be and how they will impact the company as a whole. Okay, and then finally, this is all in the before, the during, and then what you want to do is you want to use that same data that you've been sharing, and then the results of the data uh, based on their performance, or based on, not just people's performance, but website performance, various platforms performance. And you want to use that in order to get feedback so that management can make better decisions in the future. Okay. So really, that's the final step of it, is once you do this, you've got to have a feedback loop internally so that you can keep going, right? And iterate, rinse and repeat. This is something that is not just a one-time deal. This is not a single process that you put into place. This is an iterative process that is as much about refinement as it is about the initial setup and going through it once. Okay. So at this point, I'm actually going to slow down, and my hope is that at this point, we can actually open up the conversation to questions, and dig into some questions that people have either about process, how you would do this, challenges that you have that you want to overcome. We could open it up to technology questions. We could open it up to other things as well, random questions that you might have about, I am part way into the process and I've hit a roadblock and I don't see how to move further, okay? One other thing that I'm going to show before we do that though is the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And I'm going to stop the slide and restart it from there. And now we seem to have a technology glitch. See, this is what happens in any roadmap. I'm going to switch over and share the slide like this. Okay. For those of you that are that have seen this type of thing before, you'll recognize that this is a Gartner, sorry, not a Magic Quadrant, a hype cycle. My apologies. The little glitch here threw me off slightly. So what we're looking at here is the hype cycle for digital marketing in 2020. So it's less than a year old at this point. These hype cycles are really interesting because what it does is it shows how innovation in a particular sector sparks excitement and expectations in an industry. And then as things start to move along, it shows, and people are really excited, lots of inflated expectations happen. Okay, and we call this here the peak of inflated expectations because there is always a fall off point to this where people, suddenly think, oh, this isn't as good as I thought it would be. One that a lot of people are familiar with is artificial intelligence in general. It's got its own hype cycle, and it's got it from everything from the Terminator movie to Wall-E and various things, that either it's going to save humanity or it's going to be the end of humanity. And as it goes through a cycle, it eventually starts to reach more towards a steady state of what's actual. So if we look at it in terms of the stability of digital marketing, the most stable aspect we have now is marketing analytics for mobile technology, right? Originally, it was more just the web, but then we started to realize how much people were using mobile devices, phones and tablets and such, and that more and more technology and more analytics and expectations were met in this area. So this is a fairly stable part of the hype cycle at this point, right? Multi-channel marketing, same thing. Social analytics. If we took a survey here and asked how many people were actually, looking at Google Analytics and perhaps Facebook Analytics and such, Twitter, LinkedIn, a lot of people would raise their hands. Okay, influencers. This one's pretty stable as well. This is our understanding of when external people or companies decide to be an advocate or an influencer for our products. Originally, when this was earlier in its hype cycle evolvement, people would think things like, oh, if I can get onto Oprah, for example, then my product is going to go through the roof. And so then everybody was trying to find their own version of Oprah in their own industry because they figured that this would be the solution to all the problems. Okay, that has died off and that has really come down here. But what we're noticing for influencers is that they actually still do have a very high degree of influence, more than people, in my opinion anyways, truly expect at this point. So that will likely continue to rise. Okay. However, what is still coming down from the hype cycle is how much we can do in the marketing platforms, right? With data platforms, marketing platforms, account-based, A/B marketing platforms. People thought that if they could get data out there from various sources, that it would solve all the problems again. And they're realizing that all these data points and all these conversions are great, but there's still an entire brand campaign, brand awareness that has to be furthered and maintained, and even in some cases initiated. It can't just be simply putting pages out there, landing pages, and seeing how many people click through and what the conversion rate is. That's giving you a very mechanical picture. It's quantitative analysis, and you have to remember that from your marketing department, you still need to keep up the qualitative analysis side. Speak to the people in the company that do have connections outside of the company, get a sense for what is being talked about, what conversations they're engaging in, right? So all this coming back to uh, platforms and click-throughs and conversions and such, it's actually falling right now on the hype cycle. Okay. Another one here, I mentioned it briefly before, artificial intelligence. This is something that a few years ago, everybody thought if I can just plug artificial intelligence into my marketing, it'll figure out what we have to do next. Okay, that's really not the case. Artificial intelligence, for those of you that haven't played with it, and more than happy to talk about that another time, artificial intelligence is really good at making very narrow decisions with a lot of data. Artificial intelligence is really bad making either broad decisions, that have many elements that they're going to impact, or it's also really bad at working with a minimal amount of data. You really need a lot of data, and that's where the term, big data comes from, for an AI, for machine learning to kick in and actually give credible results. One of the biggest areas that AI in marketing is coming into play uh, is in the area of chatbots, right? Why is that? Because we've got an entire repertoire of language. We don't just have the words, we've got phrases, and we can build on that. So having AI bots able to communicate, through websites or through chat windows uh, with either prospects or customers, that's come a long way. It's still, though, where people get caught is that even though it's really good at answering very specific questions, the breadth of those questions is still very limited. And that's why on here, it's actually coming down in the hype cycle, because people think that they can employ AI and it's going to solve a lot of problems. I would say it's more like people can indeed employ AI. The technology is there and it's very cheap to play with, to test it out with your people, to put into place. However, the subset of the questions that can be answered are still very narrow. Okay, then we come back here, real-time marketing, the ability to interact with people on the fly and actually, engage with them. I would say that that's at the top of the hype cycle right now. And even though it's really amazing, to be able to do this on the fly with people and to engage and have all this real-time information, the hard part is that it's also very labor intensive to do this. So right now, Gartner is predicting that this is going to, go through the trough of disillusionment very quickly. Okay, and the rest, I would say I'm going to skip through a few of these ones. Over here, though, this is an interesting one that people are starting to starting to think is very important, but they're also not really sure how to handle it. All the questions about, for example, GDPR, what we do with customer information, what we don't do with customer information, who's allowed to see customer information, and the ethics of that, right? Because information, can be power, and even the question of, do customers know what kind of information you're collecting? So with most websites that you go to these days, especially on your mobile device, you're going to see a little thing that shows up that says we use cookies and various other things. And if you do a bit of work, you can click through and see what type of information it's actually collecting about you. And you can even narrow down what information out of a subset of information you allow it to collect on you. But by default, you just say accept all, and it collects everything, right? So this is something that, as data is getting bigger and we're collecting in more and more ways, is coming more and more into play. But in terms of what people think that they can do with it and how it's going to be used, we're still really only gathering at this point. We don't have a good sense of what people think that they are going to do with this data and how they are ethically going to handle it. Okay. All right. That was actually the last slide that I wanted to show. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can move to discussion and questions. Therese, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
So, Jason, thank you for going through that. I think those slides were really informative, and I had expressed a particular affection for the Gartner Hype Cycle. I think it's helpful for all of us if we understand where we are in our own businesses, and if nothing else, how to start beginning to make assessments about how to invest resources in a lot of different fields, but in this one particularly in digital marketing. Right now, we don't have any questions online.
Mhm.
So let me encourage the folks who are still online, if you want to send a question along specifically, that would be great. Jason, let me ask you a couple questions.
Mhm.
As you've been sharing this information with a variety of different people based on our previous conversations. So I'm wondering what you think are going to be the maybe the 2 or 3 biggest, most important kind of marker points that we're going to be aware of as we kind of make the assessment that you proposed and make this direct to consumer channel move. What do you think are going to be some of the, like, for lack of a better
Mhm.
word, pivot points that are going to be like, caution signs or even stop signs to say, you might want to rethink what your strategy is, or this is coming along. If you get to this point, maybe you need to take a different perspective or a different approach.
Right. So the biggest point that I've seen, and now we're going into more just, anecdotal information,
Mhm.
what I see publishers doing is the biggest thing that publishers really need to do at the beginning is figure out what they want to achieve. I mean, that sounds obvious, right? It's Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. Uh, but it truly is the case. So you want to do marketing automation, and a lot of people, a lot of companies know that they have to do marketing automation, but that's not very far behind where the thinking stops. We should be doing this, right?
Mhm.
So take away all the tools, take away all the technology, anything that could be possibly a black box of some sort or a gray area that you don't understand, and just say, what is it that I want to achieve with this marketing technology, right? Or with these processes, what do I want, right? Do I want to sell more? Do I want to engage my audience more? Do I want to increase brand awareness in general? What are my goals, right? At the strategic corporate level, what are my goals? And once you decide that, and again, you have to have agreement in management. Once you decide that, the next point down is, okay, what data do I need in order to act on that, right? So again, people think, okay, I'm out there on Facebook or I'm doing various things, there's all this data that's starting to be collected. That might be great, but is it the data you need? When
Mhm.
you talk about D2C channels, one of the biggest things that people started to do during COVID is they realized that because they could not necessarily depend on brick and mortar stores, and because Amazon at the time was prioritizing toilet paper over books, let's say, uh, they realized that they needed to have their own platform. So they needed to have their own website or build out channels with other strategic partners that
Mhm.
were different from what they'd been using, right? So, all right, what are the advantages of doing either of those two things? If you look at your own platform, a website or whatever, the first thing that you truly can control is what type of data you're collecting from it,
Mhm.
right? What type of data you want to collect. So again, if you begin with the end in mind, but take it one level down now, what is the data that you need in order to create actionable steps?
That is a great segue into a question that one of our participants, Patrick, had sent to us. So let me read it to you and see where it takes you.
Mhm.
He writes, we do business with parishes and keep records of our parish customers in CRM. Can
Mhm.
you talk about how to use CRM in building direct to consumer business? Should I use my same CRM or should I pull it apart like a different business? Interesting question.
Hold on, I'm thinking about that. The last few words though, should I use my same CRM or should I pull it apart like a different business? And Patrick, if it's the Patrick that I think you are out there, feel free to throw more detail into the chat there and we will pick this one apart. Um, so if we talk about CRM, there's more than just CRM out there. So CRM, is a term that used to be more focused on the customer funnel, right? It was funnel management, customer relationship management, but it had a funnel, it had accounts, it had leads, it had activity against that, contacts. But the term now that people are using is more customer engagement, right? So customer engagement has CRM, but it's also got the marketing automation and the marketing insights side of it. If it's the CRM, so the one that I'll reference is Microsoft Dynamics CRM. If that's the case, then it truly still is all one database, whether it's on the sales side or whether it's on the marketing side. And to me, this is a logical place to gather all of that data. So you've got your Facebook, you've got, and Twitter and Facebook, even though it's parishes and stuff, it's very interesting. You can actually target, who you're watching in these various platforms, and you can collect from that. So the trick then is to have all this, more vague data, start to pinpoint some of it, start to use it as triggers, start to use it as your ears. So if something happens on Twitter, for example, and it's an account that is actually one of your accounts or a prospect, you can use Twitter, the information you're collecting from Twitter, and have that data actually go directly to somebody to action it. Now, where even the basic smarts of a marketing automation platform come in and a CRM platform, customer engagement, is you can use that to, it will give you indications of what type of thing it is, right? Sorry, of what type of like emotion or context this information contains. So if you see something like, oh, I absolutely love this book or this product or whatever it is, CRM systems or customer engagement systems can actually tag that with a positive connotation and say, oh, just FYI, this person is raving about what you do. Similarly, though, if negative things are being expressed, you can have that go, for example, directly to the customer service person or the account rep that is responsible for that account and say, you know what, I think this is something that needs to be actioned. Already you can do this with email systems as well. So it's harder to do this with Twitter if you're not as familiar, but it is absolutely possible. And I'm not talking 2 years ago, I'm talking, we were doing this 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But you can also have your emails linked to your CRM system or your customer engagement system. And the systems are smart enough to say, ooh, this email just came in, I'm flagging it because I think this is something you need to deal with. Right? So to me, this is one pool of information. And the other thing that I sometimes talk about is like a common data platform. And again, if it is the Patrick that I know, that I'm thinking of, one of the things that's happening, I'll speak from the Microsoft space, but it's also the SAP space, the Adobe space, is these larger entities, these larger corporations are starting to collaborate so that you can have, instead of just having Microsoft data and SAP data and Adobe data, they're building shared platform structures so that all the data comes into one giant data lake or data pool, whatever term you want to use. And rather than pushing information across the different applications, you can have applications just drawing from one data pool, right? So to the second part that kind of scratched the back of my brain there, what Patrick said was, do I need to split this apart or do I need to keep it together if I'm interpreting right? I would say, in my opinion, the trend is more and more that you're keeping the data together, because if you keep the data together, then it's more this idea of big data. And if you keep it as big data, then you can apply machine learning and other, insights to it, visualization tools and such, to give you better information than the siloed information.
That's a great point about the big data. Some of our members are smaller in size, so just the bodies of data that they can collect on their customers to use for some of these tools is just by scale smaller. So it's a good reminder. Thank you, Patrick, for that question. It's a great question. Anybody else?
Well, actually, I'm gonna poke at the thing you just said.
Oh, okay,
You
I'll
said
go ahead.
that smaller groups, smaller organizations cannot grab big data. If they're grabbing data from social platforms, they can, right?
Mhm.
Because there's lots of data on Facebook, there's lots of data on Twitter. So just because the corporation or the business is not generating the data, it doesn't mean that they can't access big data, right? And of course, the longer you do it, the more big data you have, and the broader your reach, of course. But that's what's changing, is that this has been something that's been evolving for about the past 15 years, I would say, that technology that once only larger corporations had access to has now dropped down in accessibility, and smaller corporations can access it. Individuals can even access it. For some of this big data stuff and applying AI to it, it costs pennies to do this, right? So I would say that it's not so much the cost factor that's the obstacle at this point. It's more the fear of, oh, but I don't really know anything about it. That's true at the
Yeah.
beginning, but more and more the interfaces for these things, and I mean like the user interfaces, are becoming more and more accessible, uh, so that you don't have to be coders in order to access this data. Corporations are, like the large tech players, are actively trying to make it accessible to the average person, let's say. They're not there yet, but it's moving that way.
Right. Kind of a practical question. So if you were giving advice to any of our members, and especially those who are participating today, what are what's the one or two like low hanging fruit on the tree of things that people should be either diving into or actions that they should be taking?
Mhm. I would say, back to the theme, the D2C theme is number one. Make sure that you do have your own data collection source, your own website, your own channels. You can't control Facebook, but you can access it. You can't even necessarily control some of the moderation. If it's at scale, it's really hard to moderate. I know lots of people that have that challenge. But again, that's why you want to have your own platforms as well, and then use your platform and augment it with information from the other platforms, right? Also take a look at the appropriate tools that are available, right? There's lots of different tools for different sizes. If you look at the analytics side, for example, right, there's Power BI from Microsoft, and that's, definitely, in my opinion, it helps to be of a certain size in order to understand data sources and such. But I think, what is it? Google has its own version of this as well. Now, it's not designed as much for the larger corporations, it's designed for a smaller one. And I would have to look up what that's called, to be perfectly honest. But if I can do it, discreetly during this, I will. But there is a design studio from Google as well that, and that's Google's focus is, hey, we can give you all those things that, are very robust in other larger packages, but we can focus it towards a smaller business so you can just get in and start playing with it.
Okay, makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, unless anybody else has any other questions or comments to make, I think we're going to wrap it up for this time. I want to thank you, Jason, for making yourself available and for sharing your insights with us. This has been really helpful. For all of you who are participating, this webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending out an email with a link to the recording as soon as it's available. If you go to catholicpublishers.org at any time and look under resources, under webinars, you will see a complete list of links to all of the webinars recordings that we have in the past. This will be at the top of the list. And if, Jason, if you have any other thoughts after the fact, please feel free to pass those on to me, and I will include those in the email to everyone, because it'll take a little while for the broadcast to be transformed into the appropriate file. Otherwise, I want to thank you. Do you want to have any last words, Jason?
Yeah, I was thinking on that idea. This is a little bit spontaneous. What I can do in the meantime is I can PDF the slides.
Oh, great.
And give you the slides, and then that can go out. And even if the broadcast takes a little bit of time, that can be the quick win there.
That would be great. I'll also post the PDF of the slides with the webinar too, just because they're, so people can look at them and at their leisure rather than just the time that we're able to allot during this period.
Sure.
Thank you again. Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity. This has been fun. This has been great.
It has been. It's been really nice to have our associate members share their knowledge and their expertise with our publisher members, because, you know, that's kind of why we exist in this organization, to share information and to support each other. So on that note, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next ACP webinar. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.